As promised, we turn to the top Democrat in the House Intelligence Committee, Congressman Adam Schiff, who's been leading his own parallel investigation into all this. Thank you for joining us on this busy evening, Congressman. When you look at what is alleged in this new indictment, do you think these Russian agents could have pulled all of it off alone?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, certainly there's plenty of evidence that there were communications with Americans, and we knew this before the indictment. One of the things that's not even mentioned in this indictment is the fact that the Russians told the Trump campaign, through George Papadopoulos, we know, and perhaps through others, that they were in possession of these very same stolen documents that are laid out in the indictment. That happened in April. We know from this indictment that it was just the month before that they did the hacking. So almost immediately thereafter, they're telling the Trump campaign, we have this. And as you pointed out earlier on the show, when the president goes out in July and says, hey, Russians, if you're listening, these are some other emails we're interested in your hacking, they go out and attempt to hack those too. And I think it's very significant, not just that Bob Mueller puts the date, July 27th, in the indictment, but even the time. They want us to know that this happened after Donald Trump made that speech. And I think that's a pretty significant tell as well.
So we're lucky to have you, given your mastery of the timeline. Viewers hearing you may think, okay, well, if they already had stuff in April, which they were sharing, at least information about that, what exactly was different about what they were pursuing in July?
Well, what we've seen is there were hacks of a number of different democratic institutions, and there was also a lot of thought and care put into what is the best timeline to start releasing this material. One of the other interesting aspects, again, when you put this indictment together with what we know from the investigation and what we know from some of the other plea documents, is you have that June 9th meeting in Trump Tower where the Trump campaign at the highest levels has offered derogatory information on Hillary Clinton. The message that goes back to the Kremlin is, we'd love to have your help, but we're really disappointed in what you produced at that meeting. Now, it's only days later that Julian Assange, who is, of course, heading that other unnamed organization in the indictment, announces he's received the Russian emails, or the stolen emails from the Russians. He doesn't mention the Russians per se, but we know that's where they came from. And we also see a suggestion by Don Jr. that the best time they could use the help is late summer. And, of course, we see that's what the Russians do. They start dribbling these out in late summer to maximal effect.
So you're laying out a rather subtle approach to conspiracy or collusion, to use the more colloquial term, which is the notion that there's some sort of menu and the Russians are offering all kinds of things, and they're getting relatively high-level access to the Trump campaign, saying, well, we're cooler to this and we're warmer to that, and also here's the time that it would be most helpful. Based on your knowledge, as well as whatever you can glean and share from your own investigation, does that rise to the level of criminal intent, or at the end of the day, is that the Russians doing what many people know they've done, which is throw a lot of stuff at the United States with or without American encouragement?
What we see is really classic Russian tradecraft, and that is they'll make outreaches to people, to Americans. They'll begin by using intermediaries. They'll then see whether there's a receptivity to the approach, and if there is, they'll follow it up with other approaches. And this is the pattern we see with the approach through the professor to Papadopoulos, then the approach through the foreign ministry, then the approach through the meeting at Trump Tower. And you see that they're getting the message effectively back from the Trump campaign. Yes, we are receptive to this. In fact, the president himself, as candidate, says quite publicly that he wants the Russians to help by hacking, and you see the Russians come through. Now, whether there is sufficient proof of conspiracy beyond a reasonable doubt involving the Trump campaign, Bob Mueller is in the best position to know. What I can see are different pieces of this puzzle. But what I can see also has missing pieces. I don't know, for example, who Papadopoulos talked to about the Russian approach. We were going to bring in John Mashburn, one of the policy advisors for the Trump campaign, this week. He'd agreed to come in, but as soon as we informed the majority he was going to come testify, the majority intervened to tell him not to come. The majority doesn't want to know who in the Trump campaign was aware of this approach and who might have been in the know prior to the meeting in Trump Tower. But Bob Mueller at this point, and we'll just have to wait to see whether the next indictment on the hacking and dumping operation, if there is another, is focused on Americans.
As you say, Bob Mueller knows, Donald Trump knew for some time here with advance warning, and what your colleagues yesterday in that rather contentious hearing knew, I think, is also an open question, given just how ferocious some of the political pushback has been. Congressman Schiff, top Democrat on House